Georgia in the high summer of 1888. A man called Samuel walked into the woodland behind Blackwood Plantation with both eyes open. He never emerged the same. They discovered him 3 days later, stumbling through the dew-drenched cotton fields at first light, his face swathed in a blood-crusted, makeshift bandage, the hum of flies already thick at its edges. His hands groped the empty air before him like an infant's first blind, trusting steps into the void. His sight had been taken from him. Not by mishap, not by illness, but by deliberate, calculated decision. Samuel was 26 years old. He had tried to flee. He had been caught. And Thomas Blackwood, who owned the land, the cotton, and, through means both economic and brutal, the people who worked it, had ensured Samuel would never attempt it again. This was not punishment born of hot anger. It was policy. Cold, considered, a message etched not on parchment, but in living flesh. By 1888, chattel slavery had been legally dead for 23 years. The 13th Amendment was ratified, the war concluded. Yet in Terrell County, Georgia, deep in the southern heart of a nation still convalescing from its own contradictions, freedom was a theoretical construct, a word in a document that held little sway over the red clay and the relentless sun. The planters, who had once held human beings as property, now held them through debt, through fear, through a violence that had merely adopted a new lexicon. Thomas Blackwood was no relic. He was an adapter, a man meticulously tailored to his time. When the law forbade him from owning people, he mastered the mechanisms to bind them just as fast. Sharecropping contracts inscribed in legalese most could not decipher, debts that compounded with the predatory logic of a trap. And for the resistant, for those who dared to look beyond the fence line, punishments engineered not merely to injure, but to obliterate the very capacity for escape. Samuel's blinding was neither the first nor, he feared, would it be the last. The plantation sprawled across 800 acres of prime cotton land 5 miles outside Dawson, the county seat, reached only by a rutty dirt track that became a channel of mud under rain. The land had bestowed wealth upon the Blackwood family before the war and provided a comfortable afterlife for that wealth after. The main house presided from a gentle rise, its white columns facing east to harvest the morning sun, its driveway flanked by oaks planted in stern, martial rows. Thomas Blackwood was 42 that summer. He had inherited the estate from his father, as his father had from his before. 3 generations of Blackwoods had drawn their identity from this soil, and Thomas intended to bequeath it to his sons unaltered. He was a slight man, narrow of shoulder, with pale, assessing eyes and hands that had never known the barbed kiss of a cotton boll. In town, they called him educated. He had spent 2 years at the University of Georgia before the war recalled him. He read treatises on agricultural efficiency. He kept immaculate ledgers. He believed in progress, provided it did not demand the erosion of his own station. The abolition of slavery had threatened everything. In its wake, the plantation's economics should have collapsed. Yet Thomas adapted. He persuaded 43 of the formerly enslaved to remain as sharecroppers, promising a fair share of the harvest, a cabin, credit at the commissary. The contracts were Byzantine, the arithmetic a deliberate fog. At each season's reckoning, invariably the workers found themselves deeper in obligation. One could not depart while in debt. The debt, by design, was perpetual. This was the new system, legal, court-sanctioned, sheriff-enforced. Samuel had been born on this land in 1862, in slavery's final gasping years. His mother had worked the fields. His father was a ghost to him. When freedom came, Samuel remained, for where else was there to go? And because Mr. Blackwood promised, in smooth, reassuring tones, that things would be different now. They were not different. The cabins were identical, the labor identical. Only the justifying language had shifted. But Samuel harbored a secret, a woman named Clara, who lived 6 miles north on the Henderson place. They planned to marry. They whispered of leaving Georgia entirely, perhaps for Alabama, where Clara had kin who had scraped together enough to buy their own plot. In May of 1888, Samuel informed Thomas Blackwood of his intention to depart after the harvest. Thomas had smiled, a thin, professional curvature of the lips. That would be perfectly acceptable, he said once Samuel's accounts were settled. The accounts, when presented, alleged a debt of $217, more than 2 years' wages, an impossibility. In that moment, Samuel understood the truth. He was a prisoner, so, on a moonless June night, when the hounds were still, Samuel ran. They apprehended him in Cuthbert, 23 miles northwest, 2 days later. The local sheriff, upon realizing his vagrant was a runaway sharecropper, wired Thomas Blackwood. Thomas arrived with 3 men to collect his property. The sheriff, young and visibly uneasy, nonetheless did his duty. He placed Samuel in chains. When Thomas arrived, he did not address Samuel, he addressed the law. "This one has caused considerable disruption," Thomas stated, his voice cool. "I've lost days of productivity. The others are watching." The sheriff nodded, comprehending the subtext. Thomas paid him $10 for his trouble. The return journey to Blackwood was made in the bed of a wagon, Samuel's wrists chained to its side. He spoke not a word. What was there to articulate? He had tried. He had failed. Now he would endure the consequences. What followed surpassed his darkest imaginings. Thomas Blackwood had, over preceding years, refined his doctrine of deterrence. After earlier, less effective punishments, a beating that failed to deter, a broken leg that rendered a man useless, Thomas had pondered the problem with clinical detachment. Escape required vision. A man could not navigate roads, interpret signs, or traverse unknown country in darkness. A blind man, however physically capable, was irrevocably tethered. He would become dependent, a ward of the very system he sought to flee. Thomas had broached the concept to his overseer, Pike, a man whose service to the Blackwoods predated the war. Pike was not a stranger to brutality, but this gave him pause. "You aim to blind them, sir." "I aim to eliminate the possibility of flight," Thomas corrected. "It is a practical solution. The law might object. The law acknowledges my right to recover losses. What occurs on my land with those indebted to me is a private matter." Pike, knowing the landscape of Tyrrell County in 1888, where the law was often just the will of the most powerful landowner, acquiesced. They had tested the method once before, on a man who stole provisions and fled. Thomas had been methodical, a heated iron rod carefully applied to each cornea. It worked. The man survived, dwelling now in a distant cabin, dependent, compliant. No one else had run. Until Samuel. Samuel was brought to the barn on the third evening after his capture. The air was thick, humid, the cicadas scream a relentless backdrop. 4 men pinned him to a rough wooden table as Thomas prepared the forge. He heated 2 iron rods until they glowed a searing, malevolent white. "You must understand," Thomas said, his tone almost pedagogical. "This is the consequence of your choice. Choices have weight." Samuel fought against the restraining hands, a futile exertion of muscle and will. A leather strap was forced between his teeth. Thomas stepped forward, rod in hand. "Hold him steady." The smell arrived first, the acrid, stomach-turning scent of burning flesh, of boiling ocular fluid, a chemical, organic stench that made the attending men gag and turn their faces. Samuel's body arched, rigid with a shock so profound it silenced his muffled scream for a terrible instant before it erupted again, a raw, animal sound that would echo in the dreams of every man present. Thomas worked with efficient, grim purpose. He was not a sadist. He viewed this as a necessary, if unpleasant, administrative task. The rod pressed against Samuel's right eye for a 5 count, then moved to the left. The destruction was instantaneous and total. Pike doused water over the ruin of Samuel's face. Samuel had gone limp, consciousness fleeing the unbearable pain. "Take him to a cabin," Thomas instructed, wiping his hands. "Ensure he is tended. I want him alive." They carried Samuel to his quarters and laid him on his cot. A woman named Esther, possessed of healing knowledge, came. Her hands trembled as she cleaned the cauterized wounds and wrapped his head in clean cloth. She sat with him through the night, listening to the low, helpless sounds that escaped him in his fitful sleep. Samuel did not die. His body, hardened by a lifetime of labor, clung to life. Infection threatened, but Esther fought it with salt and clean water. Slowly, the flesh knitted, scarred, sealed his eyes forever beneath a layer of twisted, shiny tissue. After 3 weeks, he could sit up. After a month, he could shuffle, a hand on the wall, a stick probing the ground ahead. He would never see again. The news permeated the black community of Tyrrell County not as news, but as a chilling atmospheric change. It traveled in hushed tones, in meaningful glances, in warnings folded into mundane conversation. Do not cross Blackwood. Do not speak of leaving. Do not mistake the word freedom for the fact of it. Clara learned from a cousin. She walked the 6 miles to Blackwood on a Sunday in late July. The overseer, Pike, intercepted her at the property's edge. Pike said, then flinched at his own words. "I mean, he's not receiving. I understand." Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. "May I speak with him?" Pike, after a hesitation, led her to Samuel's cabin. Samuel sat on the front step, his face tilted toward a sun he could no longer perceive. Clara halted, her breath catching. The scaring was more profound than rumor could convey, 2 smooth, disfigured patches where his eyes had been. "Samuel," she said. He turned toward her, voice A long silence hung between them. "You shouldn't have come. I had to see you." "Well," he said, and the word was a barren plain of bitterness. "I cannot return the favor." Clara sat beside him, not daring to touch him. "We can still go, when you're stronger." "Alabama? My family? How?" The word was a stone. How would I work? How would I travel? How would I do anything? He turned his ruined face toward her. "I am not a man anymore. Clara, I am a lesson, a broken tool." Blackwood made sure of it. "That is the entire point. Do you not see?" Clara stayed an hour, speaking of small, hopeful things, trying to find a thread to the man she knew. But that man was buried beneath layers of pain and nihilism. When she left, she knew it was forever. The future they had imagined was ash. Samuel persisted on Blackwood land for 4 more years. He performed desultory tasks, sorting, shelling, work of pure tactile repetition. Other workers assisted him, guided him, a silent network of care and shared sorrow. He became a living monument to the cost of defiance, and as intended, no one else ran. But the world, however, slowly was turning. Even in Terrell County, the distant federal government, though weakened, began to cast a flickering light on the worst excesses of the peonage system. Northern newspapers printed exposés. Activists and investigators journeyed south, asking questions. In 1892, an Atlanta journalist spent 3 days in Dawson. He heard whispers of Samuel, appearing unannounced at Blackwood. Under the guise of writing about agricultural innovation, he received a polished tour from Thomas, who spoke proudly of yields and soil conservation. Then, the careful question, "I understand you've had issues with laborers absconding." Thomas's smile remained placid. "No more than any planter. I heard a rather extreme measure was employed. A blinding. Your sources are misinformed." Thomas replied, his tone smooth as oil. "I operate within the law. My workers are free to depart once their debts are cleared. That is the contract. Should they break it, I seek legal redress. Nothing more." The article filled a page of the Atlanta Constitution 2 weeks later. It named Thomas Blackwood. It described the blinding in precise, clinical prose. It called the practice barbarism masquerading as commerce. The reaction bifurcated along geographical lines. Northern outrage erupted. Speeches were made in Congress. In Georgia, a defensive circle formed. Planters called the reporter a meddling agitator. They spoke of lazy workers and the necessity of firm control. They invoked states' rights. The local sheriff, under sudden scrutiny, opened a perfunctory investigation. He interviewed Thomas, who denied everything. He interviewed Pike, who claimed ignorance. He interviewed Samuel, who sat with his scarred face downturned and, when finally asked directly, uttered only, "It was an accident." The case was closed within a fortnight, yet the glare of attention had an unintended effect. Emboldened, several workers gathered their families and left Blackwood in daylight that autumn, walking away without subterfuge. Thomas, wary of further scrutiny, did not stop them. Samuel did not join them. Where could he go? He remained a specter in his cabin, sustained by the charity of others. In 1893, Thomas Blackwood died of a sudden heart attack at 47. His son, William, inherited the plantation. William, educated in Atlanta, possessed a different temperament. His first material act in the cold January of 1894 was to assemble all sharecroppers before the Great House. He read a declaration. All prior debts were nullified. Anyone who wished to leave could do so free and clear. Those who stayed would receive fair cash wages. The crowd stood in stunned silence, conditioned by generations of betrayal to distrust promise. But William was earnest. Over subsequent weeks, he provided grub stakes to those who departed. 17 people left within the month. Samuel stayed. He was 32, physically strong but spiritually gutted. He lived in a cabin with an older woman, Ruth, who provided basic care. His world had shrunk to the radius he could navigate by memory and touch. William Blackwood was acutely aware of Samuel. He was the estate's living sin. In February, William came to the cabin. Ruth answered, her body tense with ingrained apprehension. "I wish to speak with Samuel," William said. Ruth blocked the doorway. "He wants no trouble." "I am not here to bring trouble. Please." She relented. William entered the dim, close space. Samuel sat by the empty fireplace, his head tilting at the sound. "Samuel, I am William Blackwood." "I know who you are." William had prepared a speech. Now, facing the consequence of his father's evil, words felt like dust. I have come to apologize for what my father did to you. It was wrong. It was evil." Samuel's expression did not change. "You think I need you to tell me that? I want to make it right." "You cannot," Samuel stated flatly. "You cannot return what was taken." "No," William admitted. "I cannot. But I can offer you this. He placed a bank draft on the table, $500, enough to go somewhere, to do whatever you can. Samuel emitted a short, joyless laugh. Whatever I can. That is a small world, Mr. Blackwood. It is not enough. Nothing could be. But it is what I can do. Why? Samuel asked, the sealed orbits of his eyes seeming to bore into William. Why do this? Your father used pretty words, too. He spoke of fairness, of contracts, of justice. Words are hollow. He taught me that. William had no rebuttal. He left the draft on the table. Ruth retrieved it after he departed. $500, a fortune. She cashed it in Dawson and buried the money in a jar beneath the cabin floor. She did not tell Samuel. What was the point? Money could not restore vision, but it could, one day, perhaps buy a different kind of possibility. Life on the plantation settled into a new, less brutal rhythm under William. Samuel existed on its periphery. In the spring of 1896, a traveling physician named Dr. Edward Morrison, who had trained in Philadelphia, came through Terrell County. Hearing of Samuel, he visited the cabin. Ruth was wary, but Samuel, with nothing left to lose, consented to an examination. Dr. Morrison knelt, his fingers gently probing the scar tissue. Heated iron, he asked softly. Yes, 8 years ago. Yes, the damage was absolute, irreversible. I am sorry, Morrison said. Medically, there is nothing to be done. He sat back, but his mind was working. There are institutions, he ventured. Schools for the blind. In Nashville, in Massachusetts. They teach Braille mobility trades. Men like you, they learn to live independently. I am 34, Samuel said. They take adults. I have read of their successes. Ruth, listening intently, interjected. The money from William Blackwood. Most of it remains. Morrison's eyes lit with possibility. How much? Over $400. That is more than sufficient, Morrison said, turning to Samuel. For travel, for tuition, for a start. For the first time in 8 years, a sensation akin to hope, fragile and frightening, stirred in Samuel's chest. Not for sight, but for agency. I would not know how, he murmured. What do you have to lose? Dr. Morrison asked, his question echoing in the cramped cabin. Samuel was silent. He had lost everything. All that remained was a slow, contained expiration. I will consider it, he said. After Morrison left, Ruth took Samuel's hand, her skin rough against his. You should go, child. You are dying here, not in body, but in soul. I see it. We all see it. I am afraid, Samuel confessed, the admission startling him. Afraid of what? Hope trying? Baby, you have already survived the worst the world could devise. Everything else is a lighter burden. In June of 1896, Samuel, guided by Ruth, boarded a train for Nashville. The Tennessee School for the Blind was an overwhelming universe of sound and strange discipline. He was taught to read raised dots with his fingertips, to navigate with a cane, to perceive the world through echo and texture and memory. They taught him piano tuning, for which he discovered a preternatural aptitude, his hearing, sharpened by deprivation, detecting nuances invisible to others. It was arduous. There were days of despair, of longing for the familiar desolation of his cabin. But he persisted. He was not pitied, he was expected. He was a student, not a burden. He learned, he grew. He began to assist newer students, teaching them the techniques he had mastered. He was piece by piece reassembling a self. He graduated in 1899 at 37. The school helped him establish a piano tuning practice in Nashville. He rented a room. He earned his own living. He wrote to Ruth, dictating letters that spoke of a city, of work, of a fragile, hard-won autonomy. He never returned to Georgia. In 1902 at church he met Alice, a widow, his senior, her own sight fading from cataracts. They shared an understanding that needed no visual confirmation. They married, and together they built a small business tuning pianos for Nashville's black community. They had no children but provided a home and guidance to several blind youths over the years. Samuel died in 1925 at 63 of pneumonia. Alice held his hand. In his final, fever-touched hours he spoke of things long buried. I believed he destroyed me, Samuel whispered. Thomas Blackwood. I thought he took everything. He did not, Alice said. No, Samuel agreed, a faint, triumphant smile touching his lips. He took my eyes, he took years. But he could not take all of me. Something remained, something he could not burn away. He grew quiet, then said with final clarity, he meant to break me. But in the end I won. A photograph, circa 1920, survives. It shows Samuel and Alice before their modest home. Samuel wears a dark suit, one hand resting on his cane. Alice's hand is on his arm. Behind them are the vague shapes of pianos. Samuel's scarred face is turned toward the camera, the ruined eyes plain to see, but his expression holds neither shame nor defeat. It bears the quiet, unassailable dignity of a peace earned, a life rebuilt from ashes. Thomas Blackwood lies in the Dawson family plot, his stone calling him a beloved father and community pillar. It speaks nothing of Samuel, nor of the system of terror he upheld. History, when it notes Thomas at all, remembers a pragmatic planter of his era. Samuel left no monument. His victory was not over a man, but over the destiny that man had chosen for him. It was the victory of a spirit that refused extinguishment. It was the slow, stubborn work of crafting meaning from pain, of finding light in an endless personal night. The barn where Samuel was blinded was struck by lightning and burned in 1911. The cabin moldered back into the earth. But the land remembers. The soil holds the memory of his blood, his tears, the scent of his suffering. His story is one among countless thousands, the chronicle of those who endured systems engineered for their degradation, who chose, against all odds, to live, to love, to build. This is resistance in its most profound form, not the grand gesture, but the daily decision to continue, to be more than what was inflicted upon you. Samuel's freedom was not handed to him, it was clawed back inch by terrible inch from the darkness. It was the freedom to choose his path, to find useful work, to know love, to leave a legacy of resilience. In the end, that is the story that must be told, and retold, the story of the human capacity to outlive tyranny, to find a dawn after the longest night. If this narrative of resilience and the unbreakable human spirit moved you, please share this story so others may bear witness. To ensure you never miss a vital chapter from history's shadows, subscribe to Tales of Slavery, and join us in the solemn duty of remembrance.